we could get into a situation where the US starts to feel ownership for Syria and ownership for outcomes in Syria, even though the US wasn't the one who brought it to this point.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm AJ Manuzzi, joined by my co-host John Allen Gay, as we have a conversation with Rose Kelanic. Dr. Kelanic is the director of the Middle East Program at Defense Priorities. Her work focuses on energy security, great power politics, and U.S. Middle East policy. Prior to her entry into the policy world, she taught political science for a decade at the University of Notre Dame and at Williams College. She is the author of Black Gold and Blackmail, Oil and Great Power Politics, and she co-edited Crude Strategy, Rethinking the U.S. Military Commitment to Defend Persian Gulf Oil. Let's jump right into our conversation with Rose Kelanic.
So, Dr. Kelanic, thank you for coming on Security Dilemma. The last few months have seen this total transformation of Syria. The Assad regime fell, this new government took over with very few shots fired, much of the conquest. And there's a lot of questions going around about exactly what character this new government will take. It's currently led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a offshoot of Al Qaeda, allegedly now mild Al Qaeda, which has begun governing Syria. And there's just all sorts of questions about what direction they're going to go, what relationship they're going to pursue with their neighbors, and in particular, what they're going to do about the Syrian Democratic Forces, the basically Kurdish militia group in Syria's east, which also has a U.S. troop presence to support the SDF and to occupy certain important areas like Tanf. And so, what I'm really curious about, the kind of general narrative in Washington has been this is this great opportunity to shape the future of Syria and with it, the whole Levant by taking all kinds of actions in Syria, by removing HTS from the terror designation list, by lifting sanctions on Syria, by providing aid to HTS, by doing all manner of putting our thumb on the scale, using development aid, reconstruction aid, etc., to shape Syria in a particular direction. And I'm curious because you have a paper out with Defense Priorities saying actually we don't need to do that and it's unwise to do so. So I'd love to hear why.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to speak with you. So I don't think it's wise for the United States to approach what's happening in Syria from the point of view of how can we shape it and bend it into some kind of situation that we would prefer or that better serves U.S. interest for a number of reasons. First of all, attempts to do that almost never, ever since the 2003 Iraq War, but even more recently, ever since the Arab Spring happened, which is sort of what led to the Syrian civil war that eventually developed into HTS or overtaking the Syrian government, going all the way back to the Arab Spring, right? The United States reacted to these protests against Middle Eastern dictators uh, in all kinds of different ways. In some places, like Libya, the U.S. actually got involved in airstrikes. In other places, the United States cut off aid, such as to Egypt. And in terms of Syria, the U.S. did not have a role that was as sort of hands-on and as kinetic, you might say. But it doesn't make sense for the United States to try to do more to shape Syria to our will, because first of all, Syria is not that important in a whole bunch of ways, right? This is a small, weak country that is devastated by over a decade of civil war. Um, its economy is wrecked. Um, some huge number of Syrians live in poverty. There's huge amounts of internal displacement, refugees, et cetera, et cetera. Syria is essentially a failed state, right? And as a failed state, It's not a place that can generate military power that threatens the United States or that would help some other country like Iran threaten the United States. The United States also has major limits in terms of how it can shape outcomes on the ground in Syria or anywhere else. Right? So, um, ever since the Arab Spring, the U.S. has tried to shape the trajectories of various states where people have attempted, or in some cases successfully, overthrew the dictators that had been ruling there for years and years. And in almost none of those cases, in fact, in none, did the United States get an outcome that it was happy with or that it truly wanted, right? And that's for a bunch of reasons, right? So we don't have a lot of control over what other people do, what other countries do. We don't understand the situation on the ground in a lot of cases. Syria is an extremely complicated place. It's a very fractured society with all kinds of ethno religious diversity, which makes it very hard to figure out who's in charge, what do they want, how does what they want relate to what we want or help us get what we and then it's also simply the case that sending aid or sending military training or advisors or other forms of support only get you so far, right? They don't guarantee that the country receiving those things is actually going to respond in the way that you hope they will by adopting whatever your sort of favorite policies are they are asking them to do, either explicitly or implicitly by giving them this support.
You spoken a little bit about Syria not being much of a prize. There not being a lot at stake in Syria for the United States. I want to look at the other side of it. And what do you think are some of the risks that the United States continues to face by having U.S. forces in Syria and by engaging in such a path as some of these folks would recommend?
Yeah, so the risks are actually quite significant. I think they far outweigh any opportunities, certainly any realistic opportunities. I think the biggest risk is that the United States could get drawn into nation building in Syria. And as we should know by now, nation building is expensive. Um, it takes a really long time, and it often doesn't work. In fact, it almost never works, right? And so, if the United States decides that it wants to steer events in Syria and it wants to get HTS or whoever ends up consolidating power there. We could get into a situation where the US starts to feel ownership for Syria and ownership for outcomes in Syria, even though the US wasn't the one who brought it to this point. So Colin Powell had this famous expression that was referred to as the pottery barn rule. That if you go into a country and you overthrow a government like Saddam Hussein, for instance, um, then you could be breaking the country. And if you break a country, you buy it, right? You then become responsible for reconstructing it. And if it falls to pieces, then it falls to pieces on your watch, and that's a huge problem. I'm worried the United States could get in a situation where it's essentially buying Syria, even though it's not the one who broke it, right? By getting so involved and becoming invested, and then feeling, okay, well, we've put these investments in there. We're going to chase these sunk costs in terms of trying to make good on our investment. If we just stay a little bit longer, or put more money in, or send more troops there, then maybe things will turn around. And you can end up in that situation for an extremely long period of time with no benefit. You also have the problem that once it develops partners or allies, it seldom cuts them loose, right? We basically never step back and then say, okay, you guys did well. You're on your own now. You can stand on your own 2 feet. This isn't our fight or isn't our issue anymore. And so, on the one hand, it means that this could be a new commitment that just stays on the US books for ages. On the other hand, the US could feel like its reputation and its credibility is on the line anytime the regime in Syria or its allies in Syria are threatened. And we already actually see some of this in terms of the US relationship with the Kurds. So um, I'm happy to talk about that if now is a good sort of segue to that.
Please, yes. We certainly hear a lot of arguments about, the United States needs to stay in order to protect the Kurds. Otherwise our other ally, the Turks, will destroy them. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just sort of fallacious in a whole bunch of ways, but it also illustrates the point, I think, quite clearly that once the US cooperates with somebody on the ground, then we feel like we have this responsibility to them. And that if anything happens to them, it it's on us sort of morally, it's on us politically, and it hurts our reputation, it hurts our credibility if we don't then defend them sort of in perpetuity, right? And so what happened with the Kurds is during the civil war, among the things that occurred was that the Islamic State, this caliphate, was founded, started gobbling up territory in Syria and Iraq. The United States intervened, and to avoid having a massive sort of ground presence, right, the US teamed up with local groups such as the Kurds who had their own interests in fighting ISIS and repelling ISIS, and helps them do it. Right, we gave them air cover, we gave them all kinds of support and training to help them fight back with ISIS, and the Kurds did this not as a favor to us, right? They were going to do it anyway because they didn't like ISIS either and wanted ISIS gone. But they only had such, so many capabilities to do that. So the U.S. teamed up with them to do it for these mutual interests. Those mutual interests have now been satisfied. ISIS is essentially gone, right? It ceased to exist as a caliphate 5 years ago. What's left is a ragtag group of militants who have been unable to launch any kind of massive or sophisticated attacks outside of Syria or Iraq, right? And yet, we already hear these calls from people in Washington and elsewhere that the U.S. must stay in Syria because we can't abandon the Kurds. We fought alongside the Kurds. The Kurds are our allies. They helped us. If we leave our allies, if we stop supporting them, um, then all of our allies around the world will suddenly question whether the U.S. is going to continue supporting them. Right? That if we change our commitment, well, first of all, A, it is a commitment. Anytime we work with some other group, it is a commitment. And B, if we try to change that commitment, rescind that commitment, it threatens our credibility with allies all over the world. And, I wish the Kurds well. Um, I certainly don't want them to get smashed by Turkey. But I think the U.S., rather than stay there in perpetuity and basically be on the hook for guaranteeing some kind of security to the Kurds, it would be much better for U.S. interests if we instead use our pull with Turkey, who is a U.S. ally, a NATO member, and talked to them and worked with them and helped maybe broker some kind of political arrangement that allows the Kurds to sort of live free in Syria and not be subjected to attack from Turkey, or at least to reassure Turkey that the Kurds are not going to attack them.
Yeah, and my impression from some of the news recently has been that there is a diplomatic effort underway where the Turks are talking with the PKK and with its leader, who they have in their detention, Abdullah Öcalan, and that as part of a grand Turkish Kurdish deal, there would be changes to Turkey's constitution to give the Kurds more rights, and then there would be laying down of arms by the PKK and a resolution of this, Kurdish Turkish friction in Syria, with the SDF joining the regular armed forces of the new Syrian government. What's interesting about all this is it kind of pulls the rug out from under a lot of the things we've been telling ourselves in Washington about Eastern Syria, which is that the SDF is not a Kurdish force. It's a multi ethnic force that happens to have a lot of Kurds in it. And so it's not, like Kurdish dominion over Eastern Syria. And kind of the moment HTS started rolling toward Eastern Syria, a lot of the small number of Arab groups involved with the Kurds flipped and started doing their own thing, and there's been some friction between the Arabs and the Kurds out there. And then also, we've been telling the Turks, no, the Kurds that we align with in Syria are not an offshoot or a branch of the PKK, which I have, there's definitely been plenty of anecdotes from the ground about, like, hey, they've got a picture of Öcalan up in their tent. Sure seems like these guys at least like the
Mm-hmm.
PKK. And now, Öcalan is negotiating a deal which would have these Kurds lay down their arms, which is weird if he has just nothing to do with them. But I wanted to maybe pull another angle here, which is a lot of this conversation, especially about the Kurdish presence and U.S. support for the Kurds, U.S. presence ourselves in eastern Syria, and some of this talk of aiding the new HTS led government is saying, well, ISIS is going to come back. The Kurds are our premier partner. They really don't like ISIS. I think you might also say they keep a really good, close, meticulous eye on the Arabs in their area in general, and not always in the nicest way. And so if the Kurds fall, you're basically counting on HTS to police ISIS. You're counting on an Al Qaeda offshoot to police ISIS. That they either won't do it or might not care as much as the Kurds do. And that just in general, post Assad Syria becomes a hotbed of terrorism if the US doesn't make the right policy calls. What do you make of that?
Yeah. So it's a great point, and it's something that is not so off base given HTS's history of being part of Al Qaeda. Like I can understand why people worry about that, right? And it really harkens to the time of the 1990s in Afghanistan and 9/11, and immediately after 9/11, where Al Qaeda has this quote unquote safe haven in Afghanistan, where essentially they're training and mounting terrorist attacks against the West, and the Afghan government under the Taliban is essentially turning a blind eye, allowing it to happen, sort of knowing full well what they're doing. The situation today is not at all like the situation then in a couple of ways. First of all, now that we have that historical case, HTS, it's by far in their interest for them to cooperate with the United States, right? If they do end up consolidating control over Syria, and let's say the Kurds do fall, and it's on HTS to keep ISIS from taking over or to keep ISIS from mounting attacks, I actually think we would find a willing partner in them. I think we would even find a willing partner in the Taliban today, because after the United States was attacked, the very first thing we did was attack the Taliban, right? So HTS, if they want to maintain control over Syria and they want to stay in power, they're going to cooperate. They're not going to allow groups within Syria, as far as they're able to, right? They're not going to allow groups within Syria to threaten the United States or other actors that could then punish HTS for doing that, right? First of all. Second of all, there's really no such thing as a safe haven these days from the United States, right? The US has counterterrorism capabilities that are just off the charts in terms of effectiveness and success, right? We can use over the horizon capabilities, ISR capabilities, right? Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and then also strike capabilities, whether it's airstrikes or drone strikes, to detect terrorist plots from afar, and if it's actually really called for, to respond with military power in the region, right? And so this idea that they could be operating in northeastern Syria and everything they're doing is under the radar, and the U.S. wouldn't be able to know what was going on or to prevent attacks that coming from. I'm putting that in scare quotes, right? Coming from forces in northeastern Syria is just it's just a misunderstanding of how counterterrorism works, right? And you don't need me making this argument to convince you. You can look at what's happened in Afghanistan since the United States withdrew. So the withdrawal in 2001 wasn't particularly well managed or pretty, but since the Taliban came to power, the United States has still been able to detect and potentially thwart terrorist attacks from actors in Afghanistan like ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan. It also sort of relates, like there's this conflation that goes on between ISIS, ISIS OG, right? So the original branch of ISIS that actually was the second IS, right? The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and then groups that purport to be ISIS or parts of ISIS and have taken that name but exported it to Afghanistan, like ISIS Khorasan, right? And so we hear in the media, oh, there was an attack, there were two attacks, major attacks last year, and it's true, there were. in Iran and in Russia by ISIS, but it was not ISIS in Syria. It was ISIS in Afghanistan, Pakistan that did these attacks, right? But the United States actually got wind of both of these attacks before they occurred and warned the Iranian authorities and warned the Russian authorities. And unfortunately, those warnings were not heeded, which is tragic and awful and sad, and not the United States' fault. Other well publicized cases of ISIS plots include last year the Taylor Swift concert plot, where a couple of Austrian teenagers who were inspired by ISIS had these designs on blowing up or setting off bombs at a Taylor Swift concert in Vienna. The United States also detected that plot and warned the authorities in Austria. And because Austria trusts the United States, they listened and foiled the plot, right? So our capabilities to actually combat terrorism from afar, where we have no troops on the ground, are actually really high. To such an extent that I would argue there's no such thing as a sanctuary anymore from U.S. reach.
What about the issue of Iran vis-a-vis Syria? You know, Iran has considered Syria as sort of a supply line for its efforts to protect power in the region. What does the fall of Assad portend for a power player like Iran, and especially in the kind of weakened state that it's in? And how should that inform U.S. policy?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that has been out in the ether in terms of arguments is that okay, well, now that Bashar al-Assad has been ousted from Syria, Iran is really weak, and now is the perfect time to go after Iran at a time when they're the weakest, right? And again, this really misunderstood understands the situation and sort of what's going on, right? In a whole bunch of ways. So it's certainly bad for Iran that Assad fell. It means that Iran's not capable of supplying Hezbollah through Syria in the way that it easily could before. Now, at the same time, because of the Israeli war in Lebanon, Hezbollah is also not so much a threat anymore. So Iran has seen a real rollback in terms of its power and influence in the region. And I'm not going to cry any tears for Iran on losing, you know, Assad as an ally. Like I think that's perfectly fine. But the whole premise of the question is based on this idea that Iran's threat to the United States, which it just patently is not, right? Iran is a weak country, right? It's a very populous country. It's a pretty big country, but it's extremely weak. There's an unpopular government there. It can't project power anywhere near the United States. It can't even project power into Israel in a conventional sense, which is why they've relied on proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis to do it, right? And it's why the fall of Syria makes it even harder for Iran to attack other countries in the region because it doesn't have that sort of ground conduit anymore, right? But it really shouldn't have much of an effect on U.S. policy towards Iran because Iran is weaker now, but they were already really weak, right? The fact that Syria was like a prize to Iran in terms of Iranian security is itself indicative of how extremely weak Iran is and was and is. The U.S. doesn't need to be involved in intrigue in Syria to thwart Iran because Iran's not a threat to the United States. They just aren't.
Yeah, it's been interesting watching the reactions inside Iran from the regime to their defeat in this situation. They kind of went through the five stages of grief on it. They were for a long time in denial that it mattered all that much. They were out there stating, like, well, we had a lot of fronts and this was just a place, where we were assisting. We weren't really sending all that many of our people. They had, some anger where they were kind of blaming the Syrians for falling. There was a fascinating interview by an IRGC general who'd been on the ground there talking about how bad the conditions in the Syrian military were. How the officers would get 50 liters of heating fuel for the whole winter for their homes, and their heaters used 5 liters a night. And so they would be gathering people by the dozens all into one room in order to stay warm, running the heater just for a couple of hours. and pooling their resources. Like it felt almost like Iran's Afghanistan, except squared, in the sense that our partners in Afghanistan were super corrupt and not very effective, and these guys, it was even more so. But anyway, I wanted to pivot over a bit to oil, energy, security, etc. And since we're talking about Iran, one of the big arguments that you hear in Washington for us being really involved in the Middle East in general and in the Gulf in particular is it's got a lot of oil. Some huge fraction of the world's internationally traded oil. It's got a lot of capacity to vary how much they produce, and it all goes out, or most of it goes out through the Strait of Hormuz on ships, through this narrow area along the whole Iranian coast. And the Iranians have developed this big ability to interdict it, hit oil facilities in the area. And so there's a sense that like they might be weak, but they've got their weak little boot right on our neck with the oil supply in the Strait of Hormuz, and we need to be there to counter them. What do you make of that?
So, two things. The fact that we're there to counter them is one of the reasons why the boot is on the neck to begin with, insofar as that premise is accurate, which I don't know that it really is, right? But one of the only reasons why so much oil travels along Iran's coast through the Strait of Hormuz and out to sea to the global market is because the United States has pledged to protect oil that travels through the Strait of Hormuz out to the global market, right? There's no reason that that has to be the main transit corridor. And in fact, in recent years, we've seen some countries, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, building pipelines to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, pipelines that go to the Red Sea in Egypt, which these days is not fantastic either. But you can imagine, right? If this was just a market, and the market alone, there was no sort of political things going on that affected actors' decisions about where they're going to trade oil and how, right? I think we would have a much more diversified transportation or shipping system for oil getting out of the Persian Gulf to begin with, first of all, right? So that vulnerability is in part a reflection of or result of the U.S. commitment to defend it. So, like, why bother building pipelines when the U.S. will keep this open for you for free, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's true Iran can attack facilities in Saudi Arabia with drones. They did that a few years ago in Abqaiq. Um, they could attack tankers that are going through the Strait of Hormuz, although it's actually really difficult to sink a tanker. The Houthis' escapade with the Greek ship, the Sunyan, over the summer and into the fall illustrates this brilliantly. They tried to sink it and just could not, even though they attempted to sink it like three different ways. And then they kind of realized, gee, an oil spill off our coast is like not a great idea. So let's help the international community to safety, right? Anyway, it's very hard to sink a tanker. But the oil market is extremely adaptable, extremely adaptable. Most markets are. It's kind of like what makes a market and why markets are so great. And even if there was some kind of disruption, even when Abqaiq was blown up, or parts of it were blown up by the Iranians, I think it was 5 years ago or so, other sources of oil can step in and fill the demand, right? Just by virtue of being a market and having inventories, there's huge amounts of oil still sort of sloshing around out there that can be rerouted to go to a place that there had been a disruption before. And that can happen just spontaneously, right? For economic price signal kind of reasons without any policy aspect to it. On top of that, there is a policy aspect to it, right? The United States and its many allies in the IEA have strategic petroleum reserves that, by agreement, keep at least 90 days worth of oil imports available for being drawn down. And those reserves are so massive, they're so massive, that the United States and its allies could replace a partial closure of the Strait of Hormuz for 8 years. So we have this built-in cushion, right? There's cushions in the market by virtue of markets being adaptable, but then there's also cushions that were built in for political reasons, specifically because of these kinds of issues. And so even if tomorrow Iran attacked some oil facility in Saudi Arabia, not that it would, but if it did, you might see a brief price spike in oil, not because any deliveries or oil actually isn't getting to market, but simply because you have speculators out there that are trading, and it's affecting their calculations about whether they think oil prices are going to go up or go down. When the drones attacked the Saudi oil field and processing facilities, there was no disruption to the oil market. Right, the Saudis just drew down inventories that they had on hand and shipped those out instead.
Which was wild because everybody, who looked at this issue at all closely had heard like Abqaiq, that's the oil stabilization facility. It's a critical node. If something happens to it, we're all done. And it wasn't really the case. It was wild to see. But sticking on this theme of energy security, one of the first executive orders that President Trump signed on taking office was declaring a national energy emergency. And one of the major lines of argument in that executive order is about U.S. energy security, the necessity of domestic oil sources for U.S. security through a number of arguments. I wanted to just read some excerpt from it because I want to get your reaction since I know you know this subject really well. So it talks about a threat that's posed by high prices to the American economy, but it says it's exacerbated by our nation's diminished capacity to insulate itself from hostile foreign actors. Energy security is an increasingly crucial theater of global competition. In an effort to harm the American people, hostile state and non state foreign actors have targeted our domestic energy infrastructure, weaponized our reliance on foreign energy, and abused their ability to cause dramatic swings within international commodity markets. An affordable and reliable domestic supply of energy is a fundamental requirement for the national and economic security of any nation. And then it goes on to say that more use of energy resources from within the United States would enable us to, quote, sell to international allies and partners a reliable, diversified, and affordable supply of energy. This would help our country compete with hostile foreign powers, strengthen relations with allies and partners, and support international peace and security. Accordingly, our nation's dangerous energy situation inflicts unnecessary and perilous constraints on our foreign policy. And then finally, it talks about infrastructure issues and local energy policies in the Northeast and the West Coast in particular, calls those another threat and says it makes us vulnerable to hostile foreign actors and jeopardizes our nation's core national defense and security needs. So a lot of connection between energy as an asset for security, threats to energy security, domestic supplies as crucial to attaining energy security, energy as a foreign policy asset that the United States has and could use better. I'm really curious what you think of all this talk around energy and security.
It's gobbledygook, quite frankly. I could think of less polite ways to explain it. That start with B and end with T and rhyme with bullshit. Right? You know, I mean, it reads kind of like a paper that a student wrote last minute for an assignment and didn't do any research on, and sort of came up with cogent arguments that sort of pass the smell test if you didn't know anything about the topic, but actually don't make any sense at all. It's wrong in it's just mistaken. It's not mistaken. It's policy drivel that is being used to justify what is a political decision to try to invest more in fossil fuel production in the United States. And there's not any sort of real security motive or even actual physical truth behind it for a whole bunch of reasons, right? So the executive order does say a few things that are true, one of which is that having a cheap, steady supply of energy is really important for economic growth and national security. Yep, 100% agree. Definitely the case. But the idea that that is threatened in the United States in any way, shape, or form is just false. It's just patently false. And they should know better and probably do, right? And it conflates a number of things. I mean, first of all, that executive order was in part, one of the things they reference is AI and how artificial intelligence eats up huge amounts of energy and huge amounts of electricity. If the United States really wants to become a leader in AI, and of course that has military applications that are important for great power competition, et cetera, then the US has to have more electricity and produce more electricity at home to power this AI. So electricity has nothing to do with oil, particularly in the United States. Only about 2% of American electricity comes from burning oil, right? We don't burn oil for electricity and haven't in large amounts since the 1970s, right? And instead, right, the United States has a pretty diverse portfolio of energies that it relies on. It relies on coal, it relies on natural gas, it relies on, to some extent, nuclear power, increasingly, wind energy and solar energy. Right, this is where the electricity comes from in the United States, and almost all of that, in fact, really all of it, is produced domestically. Right, we are already, certainly when it comes to electricity, we are already completely autarkic, with one small exception, which is we do import and export some natural gas and petroleum products that can be used for electricity with Canada, right? And that's simply so that we don't have to build a giant natural gas pipelines from one end of the United States to the other, right? So we export some natural gas to Canada and we import other natural gas to Canada because it's closer to do it that way. Aside from that, we're already completely self-sufficient in electricity production. And it's not like we're going to be exporting electricity to other countries because you can't, right? As it travels over wires, you'll lose a lot of energy. It's just not efficient to do it and can't do it. So the whole AI thing and oil and electricity is just completely erroneous. That's just wrong. Oil is special, or has long been viewed as special compared to other forms of energy, because of how important it is for transportation. Right. So transportation is where 70% of all petroleum consumption is in the transportation sector, and even today, with more electric cars on the road, over 90% of transportation in the United States is fueled by oil. So transportation is extremely dependent on oil. And oil goes to transportation because oil is extremely energy dense. It's the most energy dense fossil fuel. You can put it in a small container, carry it with you in a car, and drive a pretty good range with it in a way that you can't with other fuels, right? And so, the United States needs oil for its fleet, and uses huge amounts of oil for its fleet. And because oil is a global market, as I sort of alluded to earlier, there is one global price for oil, regardless of where the United States gets it. So the United States pays the same prices, the same root price, right? Aside from taxes, taxes can distort it in different ways. But the price of oil or petroleum or gasoline in the United States is the same as it is in Britain, as it is in Zimbabwe, as it is in Australia, et cetera, because it's a global. Now that means that the U.S. isn't totally insulated from things that happen in the Middle East or throughout the world that affect oil prices, because we are part of this market. In recent years, so the past 10 years since the fracking boom really took off, the US has suddenly become, we're not self sufficient in oil per se, because we actually send a lot of oil. We export a bunch and import a bunch from various places. We produce enough oil that we could be self sufficient from oil and even export it, right? And nobody really saw that coming. It's amazing that the United States can do that. But as long as we are part of the market, it really doesn't matter in terms of what consumers pay at the pump. Right? It's strange because as a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, we used to hear about oil prices on the news, and oil prices went up today, and X number of dollars a barrel, and wow, this is really bad for the United States, bad for consumers. And it was always bad when prices went up, and always good when prices went down. Ever since the fracking boom, now prices it's bad if prices go up or down, right? Because if prices go down, oh no, that means that the frackers in the United States, the oil producers in the United States, are going to be having trouble, right? So, like, this idea that oil prices being low could be bad for American oil producers is something that's just sort of like totally different from how it was 20, 30 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it's an interesting thing. Like, Donald Trump seems, I mean, nobody really knows, but he seems pretty intent on turning the United States back into a self sufficient country, right? Like, he does not seem to like trade. He does not He's tariff happy, right? He might be interested in long-term decoupling from China and many of our other trade partners, et cetera, et cetera. It's a policy choice for the United States to be part of the global oil market, right? We could say, actually, we're not going to export any oil and we're not going to import any oil, right? We could do that. We could do that now. But the United States, I don't think he's going to do that. I hope he's not going to do that. The United States shouldn't do that because even though there's downsides to being part of the oil market, so if prices go up because of something that happens in say Russia and Ukraine, that hurts the United States, that hurts U.S. consumers, although it helps U.S. oil producers, right? Um, Ultimately, it's still a major source of diversification, right? It means that we can have access to oil from all over the place if something bad were to happen here, right? If some massive hurricane knocks out refineries along the Gulf Coast that are really important for the United States, right? We can easily turn around and just buy oil from somewhere else because we're part of the global system, right? We're part of a bathtub that's 100 million barrels of oil, roughly, rather than 20 million barrels of oil. Right. So it actually gives us a lot of supply security being part of that, but it does mean that we are tied to things that happen in other places. Right? That was long, but you spit me up about oil. I can just keep going.
Oh yeah. Well, and I mean you've written a lot in the past about oil as like a geopolitical weapon. How good of a weapon is it? Can you use oil like a weapon?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So it's not a good weapon in the way that we tend to conceive of it, right? We tend to think of the 1973 OAPEC, so the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. We tend to think of the OAPEC production cuts and embargo and how that affected things in the United States, right? And so there's a perception, a misperception that is all over the place that oil can be used as a weapon by countries that threaten not to sell it to you anymore and demand that you do something, that you change your policy in some way, right? That case is just severely misunderstood, and it wasn't true then, and it's certainly not true now, right? The United States, the issue in question was, APEC wanted the U.S. to stop supporting Israel during the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That was the demand. The U.S. did not bow to that demand, right? It didn't. And many of the outcomes or sort of lasting images from that time of people standing in long lines at gas stations, et cetera, and of gas rationing was a result of policies that the United States government itself had put into place, not as a result of anything that OAPEC did or didn't do. And in fact, the congressional studies after the fact that looked at what happened found that there was no disruption. There was no disruption in oil deliveries to the United States, right? Oil companies that had been working with these countries just found ways to reroute it. So the oil coming from Saudi Arabia, instead of going to the United States, it went to some other country, and the oil that would have gone to that country went to the United States instead. So it really had no effect on the U.S. economy. It's hard for people to believe that, but it's true. So oil can't be used as a weapon in that way. Oil can be used as a weapon if it's denied with military force by being attacked, right? But that's a scenario that's a very special case. That's a scenario where you have one country fighting a massive conventional war against another. And one way it tries to get military advantage is by attacking the target country's oil supplies so its military can't move, right? The US did that to Japan actually quite successfully during World War II. But aside from a case where you have an island that you can blockade with military force and cut off all the oil going there, um, aside from that, it's pretty hard to cut it off to anybody. And so, in that extreme case, it can be used as a weapon. But in the just sort of, we don't like you, we're not going to sell it to you kind of scenario, that just doesn't work at all.
Yeah, and then kind of going to that market flexibility point that you were making earlier. My recollection is that during the Iran-Iraq War, which featured a whole lot of attacks on this main oil artery, U.S. intervention intended to protect that flow of oil. That I believe it was in 1986 that there was actually a serious decline in the price of oil to the point that it destabilized a number of Arab oil nations like Algeria. I think Morocco got impacted by some of the broader economic shocks. And this was when there was an active campaign to cause problems. I mean, it was more aimed at the various countries directly involved and their immediate supporters, but the global market had this completely different performance.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that case is really, it's really super important. I mean, it didn't just destabilize Arab countries, it destabilized the Soviet Union, right? And the Soviet Union got a lot of foreign currency from exporting oil. It was one of the few good things that their economy produced. And when the value of that cratered in the mid 80s, thanks to oversupply of oil in the market generally, it really hurt Soviet coffers. And historians have cited it as a major reason why the Soviet Union fell apart from 1989 through 1991. So yeah, it just goes to show that even in a situation where war is disrupting or they're trying to disrupt oil, they're not actually able to affect global prices, right? Not in a way that can't be compensated for or undone by various other market dynamics that led to this giant supply glut that led to low prices.
I'm a little curious about the other side of the ledger too. What about oil wealthy or oil dependent partners? And I know there's not a ton of necessarily cases out there, the most prominent one kind of obviously being Saudi Arabia, as you alluded to, but are there any sort of standard theories that are out there about the behavior of those states, particularly vis-a-vis their propensity to conflict or their relationship with great powers?
Yeah, I mean, so Emma Ashford has done really great work on this. She had a book that came out a couple of years ago, looking at these questions and looking at how oil production and oil wealth influences the foreign affairs of various countries. Others have looked at it too, and there are some, there's debate about it. It's not like totally cut and dry, and not everybody agrees. But there's some evidence that countries that produce a lot of oil are um, more likely to get involved into conflict, and not just more likely to get involved, but more likely to start conflicts. It's something that Jeff Colgan memorably described as petroaggression, and that's something. Now, interestingly, in Colgan's work, oil plays a role in enabling countries to act aggressively because it provides large windfalls of cash and also allows the government to not be so accountable to its citizens because it can use that money to sort of buy off opposition. So as a result, the government could go out and start a war that it loses, right? I'm looking at you, Saddam Hussein, right? Right? Saddam Hussein starts these wars, he loses them, and he maintains power because he has all of this money that he can use to buy off political opponents and whatnot. So, in Jeff's book and in that argument, we do find though that the oil resources play a smaller role than the government type. And specifically, he finds that it's revolutionary countries, right? Countries that have very risk acceptant leaders, where there's fundamental change going on. Those countries are definitely more prone to conflict. And if those countries also happen to have oil, they're even more prone to starting conflict. Emma's book's interesting because she finds that basically all countries that depend on oil for profits are more prone to starting conflict. And there's not a hugely satisfying explanation for why that's the case, right? That's something where um, the cutting edge research is being done out there. But yeah, it it's an interesting thing, and we still need to learn a whole lot more about it. When I started studying this topic 15 years ago, right, the topic of energy and international security, um, I felt really confident that like I could make a whole career out of this because oil's not going anywhere. It's going to be really important for transportation for many decades, and I still think that's true, right? I still think that's true, despite efforts for electrification, right? We don't have a lot of EVs on the road, et cetera, but the technology is really changing, right? And even though it's still far off, in 30 years, it's hard for me to imagine oil mattering in the same way that it does now because people will have switched to greener energy. And because battery development is so much better, right, that now we can rely on electric grid to power our cars instead of the super energy dense oil, right? And it's an interesting question, like what's that going to mean for the Middle East? What's that's going to mean for oil dependent countries, or not oil dependent, but like oil production dependent, oil revenue dependent countries, right? It's not going to be good for them. It's not going to be good for them, but it is going to be good for us. That's ultimately, kind of ironically, the big upshot, I think, from the whole question of energy and security, even setting aside climate change issues, right? Which is, if the US really wants to be secure and not be vulnerable to, you know, political disruptions that can disrupt oil and potentially hurt markets and thus hurt economic growth in the United States, if we really want to not have to be worried about that, if we really don't want to be involved in the Middle East anymore, right, we should be taking our money and investing it in going electric so that none of this is missing, so that our economy as a whole is much less dependent dollar for dollar on oil, period. Not on oil from a certain place, but on oil, period. And part of the resilience that we've seen, even when price shocks happen over the years, is due in part to the fact that the U.S. The oil intensity of the economy in the United States has declined significantly from what it was in the 1970s, right? Like each dollar of US GDP uses less and less oil, it depends less and less on oil over time for a whole bunch of reasons. But that's the direction we really should be going. And I truly think over the next couple of decades, you can make a security case for investing in, the electrification of the fleet and electric transportation so that the US doesn't have to care so much about what's going on around the world. Now, we'll still care in a whole bunch of senses, right? Like a human sense or other sorts of things, but where you couldn't actually make the argument, whatever your reasoning is, that the US has to be involved in places in the Middle East because there's oil there and oil is so important for our economy. Once we get into that situation, we'll just be much less vulnerable or much less dependent on what happens in other places because all that electricity is going to be produced domestically.
Dr. Kelanic, thank you so much for coming on Security Dilemma.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security Dilemma.